All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm assuming you can hear me. My name's Ben Shapiro with RMI, formerly the Rocky Mountain Institute. Our host, Joe Boris, is joining us, was here a moment ago, but is having some internet issues. So hopefully we'll have him back in just a moment. But I thought that we'd just get started and the three of us panelists can introduce ourselves. So again, Ben Shapiro with RMI, happy to be here and talking about EV incentives and how to best charge your vehicle at home and elsewhere. A little bit about RMI. We're a research organization focused on climate and clean energy. I specifically focus on electric vehicles and transportation electrification more broadly, both on the policy side and thinking about how we really build out the infrastructure that we need to support this transition to a clean energy and clean transportation future. So maybe I'll pass it to Tom next to introduce himself, if you don't mind.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Ben. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Tom Bowen. I'm the president of Qmerit Solutions. Qmerit is focused on electrification, starting with transportation electrification for both residential and commercial customers. We leverage a technology platform combined with a contractor network that's unparalleled in the industry. To date, we've installed over 200,000 level 2 chargers. And our focus is really driving electrification through the vehicle and then broadly through the home and the commercial facility. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Looking forward to some of the questions as well. Julian?
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Tom. Again, good afternoon, everybody, and I'm thankful for this opportunity to be here for this webinar. So my name is Julian. I'm with Flow, and I'm an application engineer. So basically, Flow, for those of you who don't know us, we're an EV charging equipment manufacturer and network provider who is active mainly in North America. And basically, we're also trying to drive EV adoption through offering the best EV charging experience for you, for the new drivers and the existing ones. Throughout solutions at homes or in public settings. And I'm sure we'll go more into the details as Joe joins us back.
Joe, you with us?
Yeah, finally. I was in the pre-meeting and then got wiped out for some reason. But yeah, I'm glad we're all here. Looks like we've got this thing underway. So have we done formal introductions yet, or we're starting from right now?
We are introduced.
Beautiful. All right. Well, one of the things that we talked about when we were getting ready to introduce this webinar and we were kind of planning for it is who it was for, why we were here. And I think the reality is that a lot of people are starting to buy electric vehicles. They've got their electric vehicle on order. They're getting these things in. I saw recently, it looks like we've reached that 5% tipping point for EV adoption. So now it's going to be kind of taking off from here. And, this webinar is really to answer some of those basic questions that people who might have not been looking at an EV 6 months ago, whether it's because of their, gas prices or maybe their neighbor has one, they're looking at it and they're kind of asking the question, how am I going to charge my EV? Not kind of a generic, how do you charge an EV, but how is this going to fit into my life? How am I going to make it work? And how's that going to go? And then obviously we have Ben Shapiro, not that Ben Shapiro from RMI. We have Tom from Qmerit, and we have Julian Blancher here from Flow. So thanks everybody for bearing with me while I deal with my technical difficulties. And I kind of want to start with sort of a broad question. When we start getting into charging, there are some of those engineering terms, some of those electrical terms that people don't really understand. I want to talk about 110 and 220 charging. What does that really mean? Level 1, level 2. Kind of what does that mean and how are those important? And I'd like to direct that to Julian.
Yeah, so I think we kind of tried to touch base already a bit on this topic, and Tom was about to complete what I was just describing earlier. So I think we covered some of the grounds when it comes to level 1 versus level 2. I was just wondering if either Ben or Tom had more to say, but that's where we stopped when you joined, Joe.
Yeah, and Julian, I think most consumers are always interested in how long will it take, and particularly if they're looking at scheduling charging outside of their residence. And so I think you covered it pretty well with the standard level 1 charging, and it'll just vary depending on the vehicle. But most customers can expect to get some range overnight with a level 1 charger of between maybe 15 and 25 miles of range on that vehicle for that charge. Some circumstances that works great for customers if they don't have as extensive commute, if they can control that and they can schedule that weekend charge. More often than not, we see our customers are leaning towards level 2 charging when they're focused on residential. Level 2 charging will allow, under most circumstances, a full charge overnight for that vehicle. So customers are able, or drivers are able, to count on a full charge as they go through. The availability of public charging will vary, but level 2 charging can usually, you'll see them outside of retail locations, coffee shops, et cetera, where a customer might expect to be there within that 30-minute window. And as long as that charger is up and available and functional, they would be able to get some degree of charge in that 25 to 30-minute period of time.
Well, I want to kind of speak to the fact that, you know, a lot of people who don't have an EV now, they're still thinking in that kind of old mindset of, I'm going to be in my house and then I'm going to go somewhere and get fuel, whether it's electric fuel or whether it's gasoline. And because 80%, if not more, of EV owners are getting their primary charging at the house, I kind of want to focus on that. When we talk about 110 and 220, this is power that's already in most homes, right? So like that's like the dryer outlet, the utility outlet, and then a 110 is just like a standard outlet, right?
Correct. And so it does give, in most cases, the ability with a level 1 charger that would come with the vehicle to be able to function at some level of charge. What we see is most commonly now, Joe, is that as drivers would look to upgrade, there always is the issue of capacity in the home, and they have to consider that. The most common analogy we use as it relates to driving, you mentioned there's always fuel to go get when you're in your car. Most EV drivers will view their vehicles more like they would view their smartphones. Is the smartphone tends to be plugged in at their desk or their nightstand overnight. They charge it, might even be their alarm clock, right? And they can count on a full day's charge. And so during periods where you'd be using your phone a lot, you're almost looking for that emergency, whether it's the airport or something like that, to the ability to charge. And so the convenience of having overnight charge, we see about 20 to 25% of installs for level 2 charging will require some degree of a panel upgrade to provide additional capacity. Most of the panels that the residents will have in the US right now are less than 200 amp, probably 60% of those would be less than 200 amp. And so when you start to see vehicles like the trucks coming that provide different functionality, even bi-directional, those type of panel upgrades will be required.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But, you know, so we're talking about the panel upgrades, we're talking about the different kind of infrastructure back-end stuff. But as far as the charger itself, you know, like different companies make different wall chargers, you know, in garage chargers. Flow, obviously, you know, one of the sponsors of this webinar produces a number of these. As someone who may not be familiar with some of the different advantages, pros and cons of having a dedicated wall charger, a dedicated in-home charger, what are some of the reasons that someone would go for that? Because I mean, based on what we're talking about here with that 110 and the 220, if I have an electrician come out and upgrade my panel, why can't I just plug into the wall? Why is it preferable to have a dedicated charger? I'll leave that to Julian.
Yeah, sure. And that's a very good question, Joe. I think as Tom alluded to, there's a few questions that future AV drivers may ask himself and try to answer. So basically, what type of vehicles are they looking at? As Tom mentioned, those vehicles are getting bigger and bigger. Their onboard chargers may be able to get more and more power, and their batteries as well may need more and more energy to be replenished. But on the other end, they may also look at what's their daily commute, what are their activities, how many kilometers they may do during the day. And if they are looking at overnight charging, then the calculation that they can make a bit in their head is whether or not for 8 hours of a time, they can replenish their batteries with the charging solution they will select. Obviously, those level 2 chargers, they offer this, let's say, peace of mind when it comes to charging, because you can go a little bit faster and you may be a little bit more flexible. The other aspects that I would highlight is obviously when you look at different type of installation, different type of residences, there's a lot of differences from one to another. So you need to be able to adjust depending on where you're going to park your car and how you want to install your charging station. So having a dedicated level 2 may offer you the flexibility to install wherever it suits you best, and as well as those pros, let's say, of having those cables managed, those cables at the right locations for you to reach your carports. And all in all, just having a nice, elegant solution that will offer you a reliable charging. So as Tom mentioned as well, we want the drivers to come back to their home, be able to plug and not necessarily think about whether or not it will work. So having a sturdy and reliable solution is really what to look for in a charging station.
Well, Julian and Tom, I'm trying to lead you guys into an answer. So I'll just kind of stop being shy about it and get to it. There is a safety concern that a lot of new EV drivers or neighbors of new EV drivers have, often asked. They talk about, how about electrical fire safety? How about installation safety and things like that? And some cars, if you have a residential circuit that's on a 30 amp, a Tesla is very good. You can go into the settings and set it to draw at 24, give yourself that 20% buffer. But a lot of the systems that are out there, Ford Mach-E is a great example. You plug it in, it's going to try to pull all those 30 amps. With a dedicated charger or a dedicated charging system that's a little bit smarter, has some of those safety features built in, you're not going to have an overheating cord. You're not going to be tripping breakers. Everything's going to be certified and rated safe for your application. And then finally, you're just not going to trip over the thing. Julian spoke to cable management. When you trip over one of these cables, not only is it a heavy cable, but it can pull down, depending on where the outlet is, it can pull down a pretty heavy charging box on top of yourself. And, whenever you have a high power circuit, just yanking it out of the wall, it is problematic, right? I mean, Tom, you're probably the most electrician of the electrical engineering people on here. I think you can speak to some of that.
Yeah, obviously the cable management and the functionality in the garage can be a challenge, and design and products like Flow are really designed around making those products as easy for their customers to use. The other piece back to safety though, Joe, is obviously always you should ensure that your installation is done properly permitted and evaluated by a licensed engine or an electrical technician as they're doing that level of install. Installed properly, these are very safe. The problems with electrical vehicles pale in comparison to the traditional ICE engines, issues that have been seen over time. And with the proper installation, again, there's really no concerns. The discussion around draw, and I think you'll get to that a little bit, some of the questions I'm seeing, the questions in terms of time of use and when you use your power and load constraints of the utility are all considerations that these smart chargers are factoring into those discussions. And consumers should think about how they use their charger, time that they use their charger. But again, we would say with the proper installation, these are very safe devices.
Yeah, I think that's, the data bears that out, and we'll put some of that into the notes here. Now, as you did mention, Tom, there are some people asking questions about the grid. If everybody plugs into the wall at the same time, is this something that, is there going to be electricity for my car when I plug into the wall? And Ben, I know that, we can speak a little bit more about the grid in and of itself, and that's kind of one of your levels of expertise. But in addition to, having that confidence within the electrical supply, right, there's other things that we're doing from a policy level, from a national level, to kind of improve the quality and improve the guarantee of that availability. And there's other things that we can do locally within our municipalities and with our utility companies to try to make those things better. Can you speak to that a little bit, Ben?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I'm happy to. I would say that from the individual consumer perspective, you either have recently bought or are thinking about buying an EV. You shouldn't really be concerned about being able to get the necessary electricity to power your car, either today or in the future. That is something that your utility, your local utility, their regulator, if they're a private company, state government and so forth, are very actively planning around. But it's not to say that that's a given from a broader societal perspective, and there's a lot that we need to be doing to put in place the necessary infrastructure to procure energy and ideally renewable energy to power these vehicles. So I think that from the individual perspective, that will all be figured out, which is not to make light of it, but I don't think there should be a concern from the EV driver perspective. With that said, I think there are things that we can all do to support more of a transition to this being a fundamental part of our transportation system, such as encouraging local leaders to put in place EV-ready building codes so that when you build a new apartment complex or something like that, you put in place the wiring as part of the construction to save costs so that you can hook up EV chargers much more easily at lower overall cost than if you were to retrofit that building down the line. Things like that, potentially advocating at the state level to put in place policies that support not only incentives to purchase EVs, but also incentives to secure the infrastructure or the chargers for individuals, for workplaces and so forth. So lots of work to be done there, but I think that by simply joining this community and driving an EV today, you're really taking the first important step towards that.
And are there organizations, I know you're with Rocky Mountain Institute, are there organizations, whether it's like yours or yours, that people can subscribe to, can kind of follow along with, so that they can see these opportunities locally to be able to, try to influence change and try to make that change happen more quickly and more sustainably?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thanks for the opportunity for a shameless plug for RMI. We are, I think most of our work
are nothing if not shameless here.
Most of our work is a little bit more on sort of the research side of things, right? What needs to be done to really lay out the roadmap to reach these clean transportation goals that we have and to build the infrastructure to support that system. We don't do a whole lot of direct advocacy. But we do have a lot of great information, including things like, the topics we're discussing today and, what might make most sense for me as an EV driver. What can I do to support this? There are a handful of other organizations. I don't think I'll go through a list at the moment, but happy to follow up with some that, depending on the topic people are interested in, can certainly help to both provide information and provide opportunities to support the policies and the incentives that I think are really going to be critical to push this forward more quickly.
Yeah. Now, I just want to kind of stop here. When we were going through this, and I wouldn't call it a rehearsal, it's a little less formal than that, but when we were going through all this, Ben had this really great line, and he said, there's plenty of reasons. Let me see. I wrote it down because it was so good. There's no reason to feel bad about driving an EV, and there's lots of reasons to feel good about it. And through your work at RMI, you're doing the research, you're doing those things. One of the things that critics of EVs will often say is, well, you're just moving the emissions from your tailpipe to a coal plant, but that's not really what's happening, right?
No, that's I think a misconception, and perhaps verging on sort of baiting from EV detractors, shall we say. I think that in most parts of the world, and I would even venture to say today, it might be almost all of the world, the electric power mix is sufficiently clean. And that's not to say that it's very clean, but it doesn't have to be that clean for EVs to be a more, from a carbon perspective, environmentally sustainable choice than internal combustion engines. There is a lot of good and compelling research here that shows, even in a place like China, for example, where the electric power mix is considerably more coal intensive than we have in pretty much any part of the US, there are still very significant net benefits from a carbon perspective from driving an EV relative to an internal combustion engine vehicle, a traditional gasoline car, that is.
Okay, so let's just say, let's kind of take the next step. Let's say we're convinced, right? You've answered all our questions. We're confident in the supply of electricity going to be there. We have done the research. We've gone to your company's website. We've looked at everything. We go, wow, this is great. This is what I want to do. I want to be more sustainable. I want to kind of kick this back to Julian. There are smart features that are worked into some of these chargers that are out there that will enable you to kind of be on off-peak hours when that sustainable energy is more readily available. And there's some cost-saving stuff there as well, right? Like your smart chargers can help figure out when the least expensive time to charge is. Is that correct?
Sure. Thanks, Joe, for the question. So I think it's important to maybe make a difference between different type of level 2 charging stations. So there are the smart charging station, the network charging station. So those are charging stations that are connected. And they are also what we refer to as dumb chargers, or just let's say simplified charging stations
less
that
smart.
could simply that would simply provide you with the power output when you plug it, right? And that's all it does, but it does it very well. So there's those two options, right? So with the network capabilities of a connected charger, as you're right, there are a lot of advantages that can be leveraged for the EV drivers. As Ben mentioned, there's a lot of utilities out there that are making great progress and that are building programs or incentives towards EV charging. So that would be, I think, a first step for an EV driver to maybe try to search about its area and whether or not there's some of those incentives to buy a connected chargers or some rates to preferably charge at certain period of the day. And with those connected charging stations, that's exactly what it will be able to do. So a few of those features could be to have some charging schedule, so charge for certain periods of the day, limit the power output if you have certain peaks for your residents, or just even one step further, participate in some demand response program with those utilities that may have those in place. So there's a lot of benefits to having a connected charging stations.
Now, I just want to touch on that demand response thing. For anybody who's listening to that who is not 100% familiar with what demand response means, Julian, can you give us a 10-second lesson on that one?
Yeah, sure. And maybe, Ben, I'll let you complete it if you have more to say. But I would say that demand response as a whole is a way that utilities are trying to influence all the loads they have on their grid and trying to control them to a certain extent. And it can really vary in forms. It can be very advanced, very complicated, where they would ask certain people to charge expressively for an event, a certain period of time. Or it could be more passive, where they would just simply say to all EV drivers in their area, well, we're going to incentivize charging between those times of the days. So that's really the quick, let's say, overview of demand response. But I'm sure, Ben, if you have more to say, I'll let you.
Yeah, no, I think that's all right, Julian, and well said. All that I would add would be, whether we're talking about demand response or more broadly managed charging and moving around when the charging takes place, I think the way to think about this is that it doesn't always cost the utility the same amount of money to provide you the same unit of energy. That varies throughout the day, and that varies based on if everybody wants their energy at the same time, everyone comes home from work and plugs and turns on their electric oven and all these things, that quickly gets to be expensive for the utility. So this whole slew of programs, again, demand response and other types of managed charging, time of use rates, all of that is intended to communicate a price signal to individual consumers that if you move around when you need that electricity, whether it's for your car or whether it's for other appliances, there's value to that. And sometimes that value comes through the form of just lower electricity rates. So that's we call a time of use rate. But sometimes there are more active programs where the utility will give you credits for reducing your demand or other more advanced forms of these programs. So the whole point is just sort of communicating price signals to align with what the costs are on the utility side.
Right.
And it's an extremely valuable tool or set of tools, I would say, that we're going to need to lean into more as we go forward.
So as a consumer, that sounds like it would be a lot to figure out. But if I have a smart charger, I don't have to worry about it. I plug it in and that thing figures it out, right?
Yeah, and I'll let my colleagues here speak more to that because they're closer to it. But exactly, it's not something you don't want to be, setting your iPhone with the reminders 4 times a day. Okay, go outside and plug the car in, and then now go an hour later and unplug it. They're not usually quite that. Usually longer periods of time, but you want to have that be automated if possible. It's not that realistic for most people to juggle that sort of thing. So yeah. Anyways, I'll pass it. Maybe Tom wants to speak to that.
Yeah. I think the only point that I would add, and a lot of great feedback in here, and as a consumer, you want to be as informed as you can when you look to purchase that vehicle. And so there is usually a lot of good information through your utility. Most of the time we see customers are dissatisfied because they hadn't done the investigation ahead of time. And so they may see an increase in their utility costs, different constraints. And so most of the utilities that we partner with have great educational tools on their websites now that will inform customers about special rates that they may have available. Some utilities are during certain hours of the evening aren't even charging for that, the charging the vehicle because they're trying to drive to those times when units of energy are of lower cost, as Ben said. Some are as simple as incentives to offset the cost of the charger. So you should always investigate through your utility because they may be adding an incentive just to offset the charge of the cost of the charger or the installation costs. We've seen some utilities are bundling those incentives with that panel upgrade. And so you can actually, if you have to incur the cost or want to incur the cost to provide more capacity for your home for broader electrification, the utilities may incentivize that panel upgrade as well and give you the opportunity to opt into a program like Julian described as a demand response program, where they may simply say that during the hours of 4 to 8 or some other peak demand period, they have the ability to limit that charge. But then in a level 2 charger, as long as you're going again by 9, 10 o'clock that evening, then you'll have a full charge through the course. So it turns out to be good for the utility and good for the driver as well.
Now, Tom, you touched on something there that I know we're going to get to later because we all have the same outline, right? But I know that, you know, I want to kind of bring this up now because we're on the topic and it's top of mind for everybody. You mentioned that the utility company might incentivize kind of upgrading some of those upgrades. Can you speak a little bit towards what some of the incentive programs are with different utility companies? Like, I know PGE up in the Pacific Northwest, they're doing $500 for an installation of a home charger. ComEd in some markets is doing, you know, $500 towards the installation. General Motors and some of their dealerships, they're doing the home charge, not the installation, but they're kind of including the home charger in the purchase of the Chevy Bolt. Can you speak to how some of those incentives work and how we might be able to find out in our areas whether we as consumers qualify for those?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so first you hit, Joe, it's in some cases to always ask the question at the point of purchase if there is any additional incentives that the car manufacturer is providing, because they may be providing something to incentivize that consumer for there. The utility is a great.
And when you say at the time of purchase, you mean at the dealership or at the manufacturer if you're doing it through the website?
Correct. We partner with OEMs that have offered incentives off the charger right out of the purchase. So the consumer immediately gets a rebate through the incentive or through the OEM of the vehicle. But in many cases, those utilities, because they're planning for those grid events, as we've discussed earlier, and making sure, as Ben pointed out, they're thinking through grid management and load management. So they're providing incentives as well. And some could be as simple as, you know, $250 or $500 off the cost of the charger. And those are, you can sign up at the point of purchase and the utility will incentivize. Some are offsetting the cost of the installs. And these are residential and commercial as well. There's some very, very aggressive programs now for commercial charging. So if you own a multifamily facility, for instance, in a number of utilities, or in a number of the utility geographies, they will incentivize the infrastructure as well as the charging network. So the key message here is the utilities in this particular cases are providing good information. Managed charging was mentioned before, and so you can opt into a managed charging program with many of the utilities and receive incentives to offset your costs. And so the key here is ask the questions. The utilities have good information, and all of this makes the economics of driving an EV vehicle. Everyone talks about the performance, and if you've driven one, you know it's pretty special. But the economics as well. You see the cost of gas right now, so it's easy to do the math. And if you can get those installation costs down, Joe, it really helps.
Now, I have two things that I want to bring up. So we're talking about incentives. Some of those are in the forms of rebates that you get as a credit later. Some of those are instant, like an instant cash reduction. But there's another incentive that's out there that, you know, a number of businesses and even home customers can take advantage of. And that's called on-bill financing. Can you talk to us a little bit about on-bill financing and how we might be able to find out if we qualify for that?
Yeah, I can speak just briefly to that. On-bill financing is a strategy that the utilities will use. And think of it just in the terms of financing. If you use your credit card or another financing vehicle, where in this particular case, the utility is providing that installation or that cost up front, and then you're just spreading that payment across on the bill. So you can receive the benefits of the charger or even some of the other upgrades, the panel upgrade up front, and then pay for that over time right on your bill. And so particularly if you're seeing the advantages of reduced cost associated with fuel, if you're seeing your costs come down because you're driving in an EV as opposed to a ICE vehicle and paying the cost at the pump, those savings can then offset the increase on your bill for that piece that you're carrying, and it ends up being a really good month-to-month positive cash flow for a customer.
That's great stuff, Tom. Thanks for that. I want to talk about, so we're looking at the incentives. We've talked to that a little bit. We are getting some questions coming up here in the chat, and one question that I just have no concept of what the answer here might be. So I want to direct this maybe to Ben, maybe to Julian. Is there a common communications protocol for all types of charging stations in order to communicate with the grid for the issues you mentioned? Now, that's really important, right? Because as a consumer, I don't know any of that kind of communication. I don't, does it matter if I'm buying a specific charger that it's going to be able to figure all that stuff out through my utility? Or, is it just the ones from Flow you can use everywhere, right? So Julian, Ben, maybe that's something you guys can speak to.
Sure. Maybe I'll start really quickly. So basically with the network charging stations, how they communicate with our backends or with any backends, it really differs from one model to another. Us, for example, we are leveraging power line communication. So it's basically a plug and play approach where you would use the electrical infrastructure to communicate with the charging station. So you will just have a module to plug next to your router at home. And that allows quite a flexible approach for the install. Others might leverage Wi-Fi's or other communication protocols. But when it comes to the one step closer to the utilities, right, how do they gather those data? How do they speak to those charging stations? It will really depend on the utility itself and how they've approached their demand response project. There are actually other stakeholders involved in most cases, which we refer to as distributed energy resource management softwares, so DERMS for short, that would act as an aggregator or as a third party to kind of catches all of those charging stations in an area and communicate with them through commands. And those commands actually have different protocols that are either open communication protocols or APIs. So it really depends as well on the DERMS that is selected for demand response projects. So I know there's no easy answer. I guess I cannot really overly simplify that. I don't know, Ben, if you have more to say. I think maybe one
but
last
I think
note.
to kind of address the question, because there's the question that's asked and then there's the question that's really being asked. So I think the question that's really being asked is this something that I as a consumer need to worry about, or is this something that the home charger that I purchased, that's on their end? That if I buy a home charger that has this smart feature capability built in, I can have confidence that it's going to work regardless of where I am. Like if I'm buying it from an online retailer or buying it through a website direct from the manufacturer, it's not going to get to me and it's going to say, oh, you're in Iowa. We only built this thing for California and New York.
Correct. So on the consumer side, there's not so much to think about. I would say, though, that utilities have pre-approved charging stations for certain programs. So it would just make sure that your type of charging station would be approved for these particular programs. It's not always the case, but I guess that's the only real points to consider. On the customer side, he won't see any difference on how he install it or how he acts with it or how he charges his vehicles or just in case of demand response events. But that would be really about it.
Great. Now, I'll direct that back to Tom. So Tom, you guys are with Qmerit. For those of you listening who are not totally familiar with Qmerit, you work with a lot of the OEMs, a lot of the car dealers to do those home installations. And we've talked about this, that one of the biggest disconnects is the utilities are very verbal about this. The charging station manufacturers are very vocal about, answering questions and consumer questions. You guys at Qmerit do a great job with your FAQs, answering people's questions and getting them installed. But even you said, one of the people that you should ask is the dealerships. Often that's kind of the biggest disconnect, right? That's the last place that you're going to get maybe a straight answer. Either they don't know, they're trying to skip past that. They don't want to squirrel the deal by, giving you a high number. Can you speak to some of that and some of those resources that consumers might say, like, oh, my dealer told me this, and you can say, listen, buddy, I'm going to send you to this other website. They're going to give you the straight story.
Yeah, it's a good question. And so in most cases, Joe, we find it's just we don't know, right? You know, a dealership is looking to sell a vehicle and they may not have all of the information. We know that the utilities are really interested in connecting better with the dealerships because that is the point of purchase. And Qmerit's taking great effort into helping that connection take place so that at the point of purchasing that vehicle through the dealership, you do have some good information as to what those incentives might be. The OEM sites are critical. So in most cases, you can both connect through the dealer or you can schedule an install with Qmerit, for instance, through those vehicle manufacturer sites as well. And there are a lot of tools that are being putting in place because dealers are looking at accelerating the sales of these as well. And so they'd like to be able to connect those. I think it really is just getting the information out there and making sure that those dealerships have that. We always recommend that folks that are purchasing these be as informed. Don't rely on that dealership to provide you that information. Again, the utility has great information on that site. Qmerit has great information on our site. If you schedule an install directly through the Qmerit site, we can provide the feedback on utility incentives that are available, tax credits, all of that information.
And your guys, based on where the consumer is, based on where the customer is, they're buying the charging station, the wall charger, all of that directly through you guys, and it's already vetted with the utility company in that area, correct?
And it's very specific in terms of the areas. In some cases, the manufacturers, the car manufacturers are providing the chargers, Joe, and we install for them. In other cases, the consumer is asking for those, and we would be connecting them with chargers that are eligible for those incentives. The utilities have marketplaces now, and so in some cases, you can go online to your utility and purchase a charger and receive the incentive directly through those. And so you do have options at the way you look to procure. Again, just as sound like a broken record, but my advice is to be as informed as you can. Qmerit's a good resource for that. I know Flow provides great information on their sites as to what these incentives will be. Obviously, the Rocky Mountain Institute has great information, even on a much broader sense, as customers are looking to get informed, not only on EV vehicles, but on electrification as a whole and the impact that they could provide to them as a consumer.
Yeah. So I think these are all great answers. So, you know, I don't want to kind of keep going about some stuff that we've already talked about when it comes to home charging. There is some more questions that we want to get to, but I do want to move on. Once we've gotten that 80% of all charging occurs at the home, we do need to address that 20% that happens elsewhere, right? And some of the recent things that I've been reading about, you know, there's been studies that show that something like 20 to 25% of charging stations in some areas that are publicly available are down, they're not working. You know, their maintenance on that is very network dependent. Sometimes the location owns it, sometimes the network maintains it. Now, Julian, when we talk to you at Flow, you guys manufacture those wall chargers for people to put in the home, but you're also doing commercial level chargers. Can you speak to some of that and some of those things as far as, you know, what goes into maintaining them and why there's seems to be so much non-maintenance happening out there?
Yes, definitely, and that's a great point. As you just mentioned, so we at Flow provide some residential charging solution, but we also have solution for kind of every market segment, so public locations, commercial location, and whatnot. And really for the new EV drivers or people that are considering buying an EV, I think there's some shift of paradigm to kind of consider compared to, let's say, the internal combustion engine. So your regular cars, right, you would go once every week, once every 2 weeks to your gas station when the tank is empty, and you would just refuel it in a couple of minutes. So this is a past experience. I think right now with the EVs, what you have to consider is rather that every time you're going to park somewhere at the groceries, at the restaurant, at your home, or even where you work, you will eventually get to have an opportunity to top off the battery. So really for those drivers that have the chance to have residential charging, they will also have the opportunity to charge elsewhere. And even for those who may not be able to deploy right away a charging station at their home, they will probably find other public charging stations around them. And basically, I guess you talked about a great point around reliability. I think in the last few years, we talked a lot about range anxiety and how it might have affected some upcoming EV driver. And I think the industry as a whole made great efforts and great progress towards reducing this range anxiety. But as you just described, from a user experience, from a driver's, there's, I think, nothing worse than driving a few kilometers out of your way or trying to find a charging station that is, in the end, not working. So really, I think the industry is now moving towards the reliability and consideration. And at Flow, it's really about how we design our charging stations. So everything from the casing that we select, the aluminum products, and just the type of enclosure, so type 4X, for example, which is weatherproof, waterproof. So everything we try to select for the product, from the cables to the casing, is just made to last. I would really just want to produce those charging stations, to deploy them, to be used again and again across multiple years. So that's really what we're trying to target at Flow, and I'm sure the EV industry is moving towards this direction as well.
So there's 2 points that I want to bring up, and then I have a question for Ben that's related to this. So the first thing is that, we've gotten to the point now with some of these EVs, whether we're talking about the Porsche Taycan or the ID.4, that they can charge very, very quickly. And taking it from a very near zero, 10% charge to an 80% charge and putting 200 miles into the vehicle really does only take 15 to 20 minutes in some circumstances. So that model of, hey, I live in an apartment and I get gas once a week or every 2 weeks, you can still do that. If you're familiar with where those high-powered chargers are, you can very easily go to Target or go to Whole Foods, plug into a high-speed charger, and for, $8 or $10 or $15 while you're doing your other shopping where you have that dwell time, fill up your vehicle with, electrons or electric juice or whatever that electric fuel stuff is made out of, right? The question that I wanted to ask, we're talking about this reliability. We're talking about, great, Flow is making these corrosion resistant chargers that are low maintenance, and some other manufacturers, I'm sure, are trying to catch up to what you guys are doing as well. But this is a question for Ben, and I think that, Ben, maybe you have more insight on this than the rest of us do because of your role in kind of a research phase. We have this new, NEVI law, the new bipartisan infrastructure law coming out. We're talking about $5 billion being spent on setting up chargers every 50 miles. What does that really look like? And, how can we kind of ensure, as people who are, as taxpayers ultimately funding this, how can we make sure that what's going in place there is going to be something that's going to last and going to be reliable?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Maybe just briefly to go back to the previous discussion, because I want to make a point here. We often throw around this number that about 80% of charging currently takes place at home. And I think Tom mentioned this earlier. That's great. And we want to do as much of that as we can because people can charge overnight, relatively low cost, relatively low emissions. We want to do as much of that as we can. But I think it's also important to recognize 2 things. One, many, and I would say the majority of EV owners today live in single family homes where that's a lot easier than it is for people who live, for example, in multi-unit dwellings. So just let's call ourselves an EV community, right? We need to be aware of the fact that that's not representative of the whole population. And so we need to be thinking more and more about how we can provide sort of equitable access to EV charging for everyone. Over time, I think that percentage of home charging will decrease, in part because we'll have a broader sort of tent of people who are driving EVs, not all of whom have easy access. Now that relates to this other discussion around these, charging outside of the home, whether you go to the grocery store or to the department store, or, you need to sort of top off things at a DC fast charging station. That's all I see it as, you don't want to only have one location where you can charge. You want to have a lot of options. Most of that, if you can do it at home overnight, wonderful, but we're going to all need a broader system. And so we definitely want to support putting in place a pretty broad network of chargers that can fill up everyone's cars as they need it. Now, to segue into your actual question, Joe, and thanks for humoring me there. So NEVI is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. This is a program that the Biden administration is putting forth that came out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was signed into law last November. So I think people are at least generally familiar with this multi-billion, or actually I should say $trillion larger package. Within that, there are $7.5 billion dedicated to EV charging infrastructure. And of that, the lion's share, so $5 billion out of the $7.5 billion, goes specifically to all of the states, plus DC and Puerto Rico, to put in place specifically DC fast charging stations, as Joe mentioned, every 50 miles along what we call alternative fuel corridors, or more specifically, electric alternative fuel corridors. That's a lot of kind of jargon and perhaps a little bit confusing, but I think that the way to think about this program, which is getting a lot of attention from state departments of transportation right now, is that each state is getting a big chunk of change. So I think Texas gets the most, followed by California. And there's a formula that I won't go into as to which states get what. It's not just population. And that specifically is going to really develop a critical backbone of fast charging stations along the nation's interstate highways. And so if you think back to, I believe it was the Eisenhower administration in the 50s putting in place the interstate highway system in general, that was this huge public effort to sort of build out a network that we're going to use. This is a smaller version of that along those interstates that's focused on really providing confidence for consumers that they can go on a road trip and they can fill up their cars. So maybe I'll stop there. I don't want to take too much airtime, but that's what this program's about.
Yeah, there's something I want to mention here, because you mentioned that confidence in your fuel, right? When you're driving down the highway in an internal combustion car, every couple of miles you see 100-foot tall lit up sign that says Shell or Chevron, and it's got the pricing there and it lights up at night. You know, an EV charger, even the Tesla superchargers that are the most visible, right? They're like 6 or 8 feet tall. And if you're going 70 miles an hour blasting past them on the highway, you don't see them, right? So I think that visibility is a huge thing. What's being done, or what do you think should be done from the point of view of getting people to be aware that electric fuel is available in these locations? Is it a sign on the highway? Is it a 100-foot neon sign that says Electrify America or Charge Point or whatever it might be?
Yeah, well, sort of the cut and dried version of that is within the requirements from this federal program, there has to be, so-called EV signage. But I don't think that that's the eye-popping, neon lights that you're talking about. That's the road sign next to the thing that, looks like a rest area sign, essentially, with an EV charger. So that minimal amount is included and is a requirement. But yeah, I think that as this is going to be developed in most states, if not all states, by private firms that are getting this funding from the federal government through the state DOTs, departments of transportation, that is. And so they will have some latitude in terms of how they go about their marketing and their awareness and so forth. So I would fully expect to see that there are more of these kind of gas station type messaging and signage that would attract people to it, which, to your point, probably will help in terms of people understanding, oh, I'm starting to see more of this. If I was to buy an EV, I could go there, I could go over there, So I think that will help.
Yeah, I think I agree with you 100%. I can't wait to see, there was a recent study by BP. They were forced in the UK to put electric charging stations at their gas stations, or I'm sorry, petrol stations, right? Because it's the UK. And then they actually found that each individual charging station was actually more profitable than their fuel pumps because they had a longer dwell time. People were staying, buying things at the store, making use of the other services there. And so they've actually accelerated it beyond what was required. And I'm waiting to see that here in the States where we have the huge signs and the big buildings and everything else. So that's going to be very exciting.
Joe, real quick, one of the things I mentioned, most of our drivers like to view their vehicles a little bit more like the smartphone, right, in that application. And so they're available right now to consumers either through the manufacturer, the charger, or third parties. Most will use apps and make sure that they have available, see what's available. Companies like ChargeWay are educating consumers on utilization of energy as a fuel, electricity as a fuel. And so we would say in most cases, I'm hoping we don't see 150-foot giant signs up along the highways that do, but I think most of these consumers are using that education that would be
Well,
coming.
and that's a really good point. You know, you mentioned ChargeWay. ChargeWay is a good friend of CleanTechnica as well. We didn't plan on plugging them too much, but you know, ChargeWay, a better route planner, even if you have the in-network apps like from Electrify America, they do a really great job of showing you as you're driving where these charging stations are. And not only that, but also helping you plan that trip, right? So, you know, you might go into one of these apps and plan that trip, and they'll tell you the shortest times to stop here and here and go. And using those route planners like, you know, ABP and ChargeWay, it really does help in terms of confidence. I don't want to wrap up, but I know we're coming to the end of our time contract here, and everybody's, you know, got busy stuff, including the people who are attending this webinar. So first of all, thank you for everybody who's been paying attention to us. Thank you, Tom, Julie, and Ben. This has been great stuff. I do want to get to some of the questions that are in here, and there's a few that I think are really good. You know, I want to speak to this one here. There are different battery developments to increase the EV's range. Solid materials, liquid and Li-ion batteries or li-metal batteries. Should EV customer or EV charger customers replace their units with new ones? I can't speak to stuff that happens in the future because, like, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not Karnak the Magnificent, for those of you who are old enough to know who Johnny Carson is. That's not too many people anymore. But I think that anybody who's developing this, that electricity that's coming out of your wall, that 120 or 220, that is going to be the variable that's already been solved for. And I want to say that anybody who's developing a new advanced battery technology is doing so with the understanding that it's going to have to be compatible with 110 or 220, because trying to develop something for something that just doesn't exist, it's not something that we use in, you know, the developed Western world, I think is going to be a hard sell. But you know, obviously we've got Julian here, we've got Ben here. They're the engineers, and they've got their finger on the pulse of what's actually happening out there. I mean, do you guys think that's something we need to be concerned about? Are we all going to Osborne ourselves, to use the Osborne 2 business analogy? Or are we all going to just wait until there's an instant charging, you know, solid state cordless system? Or is that something that it doesn't really make a ton of sense to be concerned about at this point?
I would just say briefly, I think that things are changing quickly, but they're not changing that quickly. And so if you have a current EV that's working for you, I don't think you're going to get, you know, leapfrogged overnight by the newest technology. If you find that there's some features of newer models, whether that's of EVs or of chargers, that aren't available to you today, in a couple of years, there's always the option of selling your current EV and buying the newest one. There's a very strong used market today, both for EVs and for conventional vehicles. I don't think that's going to change too much in the next couple of years. So I would probably say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and maybe leave it at that.
Yeah. Yes. On my end, I don't have much more to add. Julie. Sorry. No. I was thinking you were about to throw me the question again. So I don't have much more to add than what just been described.
No. I love that I got interrupted to be told that there's nothing to interrupt me for. This is the best webinar so far. All right, so there's a question here. Do you have a special directive in the U.S. for electrical engineers who install charging stations issued by regulatory or standardization organizations? I want to say yes, that you just can't willy-nilly start splicing into electrical cables. But I mean, like, I've electrocuted myself before. I think Tom is probably the best person to answer this.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously it starts with, and we always say, you know, the safety and compliance of your electrical contractor, right? So you have to ensure that they are properly licensed and insured, C10 electrical contractors to be able to do the work, right? And so that always stands out. As we see funding come in through the states, the utilities, or federal government, there are different certifications that are being introduced as part of that. An example might be an EVITP certification for installations. So nothing, Joe, that has been set across that says mandated across all functions to be able to do that, to say no electrician that isn't a certain standard certification can't do that work. We would always default to the C10 license and the proper insurance. And then the funding sources will drive what other certifications, whether it's utility incentive program, those type of things.
Now, when you say we, you mean Q Merit. So if I go through a Q Merit or if I go through the OEM, I can have confidence that I'm getting someone who's licensed, insured, kind of knows what they're doing kind of thing. Is that what we're getting
Yeah,
at?
I think that's always the biggest concern is ensure that it's proper licensed, that electrician isn't a handyman, that can do that work or raises her hand and say, sure, I can do that work, right? And ensuring, in many cases, we see our OEM customers or partners that feel like they have electricians, but nobody checks those licenses, no one checks the insurance, those type of thing. It's because this is electrical work, and you mentioned the issue of safety previously. These are safe technologies, but they do require proper installation. And so Q-Merit, that's why so many of the OEMs do contract with us to do their residential installations, is that they're assured that we are providing a contractor base that is licensed, insured, background checks, all of the things that you would want as you're letting an individual or a contractor into your home.
All right. And then this one, I don't even know where to go to answer this question. So I'm going to pitch it to Ben because Ben seems smart. The federal tax credit for installing EV charging systems recently expired at the end of 2021. Is it on the table for a retroactive renewal this year?
Yeah, great question. I do not know the answer to that. I haven't heard anything to that effect, but I have not been looking that closely into that particular program. So apologies, but I can't really help on that piece.
Yeah, no, it seems like there's not I'll speak to it at least this much. It doesn't seem like there's an appetite either from the current administration or the current Congress, and that's either house of Congress, to continue rolling out tax incentives and rebates on EVs. If you look at what's been happening, obviously Tesla and GM have both burned through their $7,500 tax credits. This last quarter was Toyota's last quarter to qualify for the full tax credit. And there doesn't seem to be a big appetite to extend that or to grandfather in, like, you know, the 250,000th guy to buy a Tesla, right? So I'm going to say no. I mean, I'll look into the crystal ball and say no. And if I turn out to be wrong, I'll edit that out.
Yeah, Joe, most of the activity we've seen in the discussions on extending the tax credits have been towards driving lower price points.
Yes.
And so we do see some activity in that, and there's great progress made, you know, through the relationships we have with the OEMs. We know that in the next couple of years, there'll be 150 plus new models that are coming out of EV vehicles. And
that's only in the brands that are currently selling in the US. That's not including the Chinese that are going to start bringing over another 150.
Correct. And those price points are coming down significantly. And so we don't have time to explore it too much, but as Ben mentioned, this is going to open up for substantial, a big population of drivers. And as we know, in states like California, where close to 50% of the residents in California live in multifamily, that creates potential challenges. I can just assure the potential drivers out there that the OEMs are aggressively looking at ways to work with companies like Q-Merit, work with companies like Flow to find strategies for their potential buyers that do live in those multifamily to ensure that they do have adequate charging available at their residence.
Well, maybe just one more point here, Joe, to specifically to the question, given it's around EVSE, the chargers themselves. I would say, you know, this is very case dependent, but definitely if you have not already, check out your local utilities webpage and any state level programs, because I think that often people are not fully aware of everything that's out there. Recognizing you, who asked the question, whoever that was, may already have done this, but if you haven't, I would certainly encourage you to take a look there.
Yeah, 100%. I really like this question. I know we're going out of order here, but we're basing this on questions I like best. So sorry, guys. There is a jerry can in most of today's vehicles in case a vehicle goes out of gas. Well, I mean, I think most of today's vehicles is probably a stretch. I haven't had a jerry can in one of my internal combustion cars in about 20 years, but fair enough. You probably have one of yours. What will replace that in EVs? Now, so there's a couple of companies now. There's one in specific that is, or in particular, that is working with Hyundai and Kia. They have a product called the Roadie, where if you call your roadside assistance that you're out of juice, they're going to bring this essentially a lithium-ion battery pack that'll plug into your car and give you 5 or 10 miles of juice to get to the next charger. Now, that said, there does seem to be a recent set of patents from General Motors as well as Ford to show that you can charge your electric vehicle from another electric vehicle. I haven't seen that in practice yet too much, but maybe one of my fellow panelists can speak to that vehicle-to-vehicle charging a little bit more. Lots of confused faces, guys.
Yeah, I guess
not filling me with confidence.
I think really the analogy that it would be closest to a jerry can to me would just be level 1 charging, just having this card in the trunk and what we would refer to as a trickle charging, right? I think finding a typical outlets would be, in most cases, something you could do when you're in that type of situation. But to your point about vehicle-to-vehicle charging, I cannot comment. I do not know of where it might go. So
yeah, I'll put a link to that in the show notes when we do the YouTube version. I'll put it there.
Joe, the lion's share of the vehicles now are receive a charge, and so what we will see. We've talked a lot about technology and technology advancement, but most of the OEMs are committing to bi-directional charging in the next several years, and so that will allow a larger vehicle to send a charge into a smaller vehicle or into the home or even back to the grid. So back to creating opportunities for that. It's easy to imagine your AAA tow truck driving around with a small charger in those circumstances, just like they do with a gas can as it comes through. But I think we're seeing chargers as well as vehicles starting towards that direction of bi-directional. I think we're going to continue to see that pretty aggressively.
I want to highlight something that Julian said, because it's a very smart thing, and it's not something that we talk about too much in the realm of charging. And that's this: if you have your charging cable in your trunk and it's a 110 outlet, anywhere that has electricity, you can plug in and get juice. It might be slow, it might not be as fast as you want, but if you see a light bulb, chances are that's a place that you can plug in and charge your vehicle. So I think that, this idea that you must be at a public charger in order to charge your car, I think is one that is not, I would say, not totally accurate. Anywhere that you have electricity, you have a means of charging an EV. The last thing I want to address here before we cut out and run out of time, I think that we got about 2-3 minutes left. This one will do it. Can we address multifamily residential and commercial fleets by combining rooftop solar and PV canopies? And I don't really know how to answer that question. I wonder, Julian or Tom, do you have any experience with putting your charging stations or putting in any charging stations in a multifamily or commercial place that's got that solar canopy and how that feeds into it?
Julian, feel free. I know, Joe, real quickly, we have partners that we work with that combine storage and solar with charging, right? And the idea is just, again, most of it is on load management and making sure that these chargers aren't functioning at times where there might be higher cost electricity or grid constraints along those. Storage is a logical component to go along with charging as we go through, and storage is also a logical component with solar. And so we see many residential storage systems as well combined with solar that can work in conjunction with their charging. So it's a logical, and we are seeing, particularly in apartment complexes and multifamilies, more solar canopy and storage integrated with charging.
I would just add, Julian, sorry.
No, go for it.
Yeah, I would just add, it is a great solution. It needs to be part of our solution set. The big challenge to my mind is that we need to do that for new buildings up front. We need to do the EV wiring. We need to get sufficient electrical capacity. We need to think about if we want to have solar and storage and any other distributed energy resources there to be part of this. It's a lot harder for existing buildings, these retrofits. And so it's not to say that we shouldn't do that. We certainly should. But as you see new developments in your communities, these are good questions to be asking. Hey, okay, maybe only 2 people in that apartment, in that 90-unit apartment complex have EVs today, but in 5 years, maybe 50 of them will. So let's think ahead a little bit here and let's get this in place. Whether or not that includes something like solar to power the EV charging, all of this, we need to really front load it as much as we can and think several steps down the road.
But that's a business case also to be made from the developers. Like, even if it's not mandated, if you're developing a new property, you want to appeal to the broadest base of consumers possible. And you want people who are buying a new condo or buying a new home to feel confident that they'll be able to park their vehicle there, not just today, but in 5, 10, and 15 years. So I think that speaks a little bit what Ben is saying, that it is critical to have this stuff built into those, built into those new developments and new buildings. I think that's all the time that we actually have scheduled here. We're going to have, I'm sure a number of emails come through. I put my email address in the chat is Joe Boras, J-O Boras at CleanTechnica.com. We'll have some other ways for you to reach out to Q-Merit on their contact page, and Flow and RMI as well. Obviously, thanks for, bringing us all together here for this webinar, Julian. This was, obviously sponsored by Flow. So I just kind of want to wrap it up there. And then if there's anything else that we want to say in closing, Julian, I'll kick it off to you.
Great. Thanks, Joe, for this closing remarks, and thanks you for all those questions throughout the webinar. Really appreciate the discussion we had with RMI and Q-Merit as well. So again, I think there will be probably some communication upcoming with the links of the recording, maybe articles, or just even the email address to reach out to any of us. So again, it's been a pleasure, and really thanks for managing this and throughout the webinar. Yes.
Yeah, you guys were great. All right, I'm going to sign off here, Andy. I think we can call it, and we will have this in our CleanTechnica YouTube, and we'll make that available as well as show notes with links to everybody's contact information. And that's about it. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.